Welcome to the Virgo Potens YouTube channel. If you enjoy this video, give it a like. I also invite you to subscribe to this channel so that you won't miss new content. Please prayerfully consider supporting my work by becoming a patron of Virgo Potens on Patreon and/or by buying one of my books. My ebooks are available on Amazon as well as on the Apple Bookstore. For those who prefer a physical copy rather than an ebook, my book, Spiritual Warfare, Know Thy Enemy, is also available as a paperback on Amazon. If you are interested in making a one-time contribution, I suggest that you do so by simply buying one of my books. I am thankful for your support. Links to Patreon and to my books will be posted in the comments section of this video. The continuation of this work isn't possible without you. Lastly, and most importantly, please pray for me. May the Virgin Most Powerful guide and protect you. Holy Sorrow, God Grieves Over Christians, by St. Catherine of Siena. Through a revelation from God, St. Catherine of Siena explains Holy Sorrow, how God grieves over his Christian people and particularly over his ministers. This great saint also explains how sin is more gravely punished after the Passion of Christ. She also reveals God's mercy to the world and to the Church. The following Virgo Potens production is a narrated video of an excerpt from the dialogue by St. Catherine of Siena, narrated by Tony Capobianco. The text of the dialogue by St. Catherine of Siena is in the public domain. All of the pictures used in this video are also in the public domain. How God grieves over the Christian people, and particularly over his ministers, and touches on the subject of the sacrament of Christ's body, and the benefit of the Incarnation. Then God, turning the eye of his mercy towards her, allowing himself to be constrained by her tears, and bound by the chain of her holy desire, replied with lamentation, "My sweetest daughter, your tears constrain me, because they are joined with my love, and fall for love of me, and your painful desires force me to answer you. But marvel and see how my spouse has defiled her face and become leprous on account of her filthiness and self-love, and swollen with the pride and avarice of those who feed on their own sin. What I say of the universal body and the mystical body of the Holy Church, that is to say, the Christian religion, I also say of my ministers, who stand and feed at the breasts of Holy Church. And not only should they feed themselves, but it is also their duty to feed and hold to those breasts the universal body of Christian people, and also any other people who should wish to leave the darkness of their infidelity and bind themselves as members to my church. See then with what ignorance and darkness and ingratitude are administered, and with what filthy hands are handled this glorious milk and blood of my spouse, and with what presumption and irreverence they are received. Wherefore, that which really gives life often gives, through the defects of those who receive it, death. That is to say, the precious blood of my only begotten Son, which destroyed death and darkness, and gave life and truth and confounded falsehood. For I give this blood and use it for salvation and perfection in the case of that man who disposes himself properly to receive it. For it gives life and adorns the soul with every grace, in proportion to the disposition and affection of him who receives it. Similarly, it gives death to him who receives it unworthily, living in iniquity and in the darkness of mortal sin. To him, I say, it gives death and not life. Not through defect of the blood, nor through the defect of the minister, though there may be great evil in him, because his evil would not spoil nor defile the blood, nor diminish its grace and virtue, nor does an evil minister do harm to him to whom he gives the blood, but to himself he does the harm of guilt, which will be followed by punishment, unless he correct himself with contrition and repentance. I say then that the blood does harm to him whom receives it unworthily, not through defect of the blood, nor of the minister, but through his own evil disposition and defect, inasmuch as he has befouled his mind and body with such impurity and misery, and has been so cruel to himself and his neighbor. He has used cruelty to himself, depriving himself of grace, trampling under the feet of his affection the fruit of the blood which he had received in holy baptism, when the stain of original sin was taken away from him by virtue of the blood, which stain he drew from his origin when he was generated by his father and mother. Wherefore I gave my word, my only begotten Son, because the whole stuff of human generation was corrupted through the sin of the first man, Adam. Wherefore all of you, vessels made of this stuff, were corrupted and not disposed to the possession of eternal life. So I, with my dignity, joined myself to the baseness of your human generation, in order to restore it to grace, which you had lost by sin. For I was incapable of suffering, and yet, on account of guilt, my divine justice demanded suffering. But man was not sufficient to satisfy it, for even if he had satisfied to a certain extent, he could only have satisfied for himself, and not for other rational creatures, besides which, neither for himself nor for others could man satisfy, his sin having been committed against me, who am the infinite good. Wishing, however, to restore man, who was enfeebled, and could not satisfy for the above reason, I sent my word, my own Son, clothed in your very nature, the corrupted clay of Adam, in order that he might endure suffering in that self-same nature in which man had offended, suffering in his body, even to the opprobrious death of the cross, and so he satisfied my justice and my divine mercy. For my mercy willed to make satisfaction for the sin of man, and to dispose him to that good for which I had created him. This human nature, joined with the divine nature, was sufficient to satisfy for the whole human race, not only on account of the pain which it sustained in its finite nature, that is, in the flesh of Adam, but by virtue of the eternal deity, the divine and infinite nature joined to it. The two natures being thus joined together, I received and accepted the sacrifice of my only begotten Son, kneaded into one dough with the divine nature, by the fire of divine love, which was the fetter which held him fastened and nailed to the cross in this way. Thus, human nature was sufficient to satisfy for guilt, but only by virtue of the divine nature. And in this way was destroyed the stain of Adam's sin, only the mark of it remaining behind, that is, an inclination to sin, and to every sort of corporal defect, like the cicatrix which remains when a man is healed of a wound. In this way, the original fault of Adam was able to still cause a fatal stain. Wherefore, the coming of the great physician, that is to say, of my only begotten Son, cured this invalid. He, drinking this bitter medicine, which man could not drink on account of his great weakness, like a foster mother who takes medicine instead of her suckling, because she is grown up and strong, and the child is not fit to endure its bitterness. He was man's foster mother, enduring with the greatness and strength of the deity, united with your nature, the bitter medicine of the painful death of the cross, to give life to you little ones, debilitated by guilt. I say, therefore, that the mark alone of original sin remains, which sin you take from your father and your mother when you were generated by them. But this mark is removed from the soul, though not altogether, by holy baptism, which has the virtue of communicating the life of grace by means of that glorious and precious blood. Wherefore, at the moment that the soul receives holy baptism, original sin is taken away from her, and grace is infused into her, and that inclination to sin, which remains from the original corruption, as has been said, is indeed a source of weakness, but the soul can keep the bridle on it if she choose. Then the vessel of the soul is disposed to receive and increase in herself grace, more or less, according as it pleases her to dispose herself willingly with affection, and desire of loving and serving me, and, in the same way, she can dispose herself to evil as to good, in spite of her having received grace in holy baptism. Wherefore, when the time of discretion is come, the soul can, by her free will, make choice either of good or evil, according as it pleases her will. And so great is this liberty that man has, and so strong has this liberty been made by virtue of this glorious blood, that no demon or creature can constrain him to one smallest fault without his free consent. He has been redeemed from slavery and made free in order that he might govern his own sensuality and obtain the end for which he was created. O miserable man, who delights to remain in the mud like a brute, and does not learn this great benefit which he has received from me, a benefit so great that the poor wretched creature, full of such ignorance, could receive no greater. How sin is more gravely punished after the passion of Christ than before, and how God promises to do mercy to the world and to the Holy Church, by means of the prayers and sufferings of his servants. And I wish you to know, my daughter, that although I have recreated and restored to the life of grace the human race, through the blood of my only begotten Son, as I have said, men are not grateful, but going from bad to worse, and from guilt to guilt, even persecuting me with many injuries, taking so little account of the graces which I have given them, and continue to give them, that not only do they not attribute what they have received to grace, but seem to themselves on occasion to receive injuries from me, as if I desired anything else than their sanctification. I say to you that they will be more hard-hearted and worthy of more punishment, and will indeed be punished more severely now that they have received redemption in the blood of my Son, than they would have been before that redemption took place, that is, before the stain of Adam's sin had been taken away. It is right that he who receives more should render more, and should be under greater obligations to him from whom he receives more. Man, then, was closely bound to me through this being which I have given him, creating him in my own image and similitude, for which reason he was bound to render me glory, but he deprived me of it, and wished to give it to himself. Thus he came to transgress my obedience imposed on him, and became my enemy. And I, with my humility, destroyed his pride, humiliating the divine nature, and taking your humanity, and freeing you from the service of the devil. I made you free. And not only did I give you liberty, but if you examine, you will see that man has become God, and God has become man, through the union of the divine with the human nature. This is the debt which they have incurred, that is to say, the treasure of the blood, by which they have been procreated to grace. See, therefore, how much more they owe after the redemption than before. For they are now obliged to render me glory and praise by following in the steps of my incarnate Word, my only begotten Son. For then they repay me the debt of love, both of myself and of their neighbor, with true and genuine virtue, as I have said to you above. And if they do not do it, the greater their debt, the greater will be the offense they fall into, and therefore, by divine justice, the greater their suffering and eternal damnation. A false Christian is punished more than a pagan, and the deathless fire of divine justice consumes him more, that is, afflicts him more, and in his affliction he feels himself being consumed by the worm of conscience, though in truth he is not consumed, because the damned do not lose their being through any torment which they receive. Wherefore I say to you, that they ask for death and cannot have it, for they cannot lose their being. The existence of grace they lose through their fault, but not their natural existence. Therefore, guilt is more gravely punished after the redemption of the blood than before, because man received more. But sinners neither seem to perceive this, nor to pay any attention to their own sins, and so become my enemies, though I have reconciled them by means of the blood of my Son. But there is a remedy with which I appease my wrath, that is to say, by means of my servants, if they are jealous to constrain me by their desire. You see, therefore, that you have bound me with this bond which I have given you, because I wished to do mercy to the world. Therefore I give my servants hunger and desire for my honor and the salvation of souls, so that, constrained by their tears, I may mitigate the fury of my divine justice. Take, therefore, your tears and your sweat, drawn from the fountain of my divine love, and with them wash the face of my spouse. I promise you that by this means her beauty will be restored to her, not by the knife nor by cruelty, but peacefully, by humble and continued prayer, by the sweat and the tears shed by the fiery desire of my servants. And thus will I fulfill your desire if you, on your part, endure much, casting the light of your patience into the darkness of perverse men, not fearing the world's persecutions, for I will protect you, and my providence shall never fail you in the slightest need. End of excerpts from the dialogue by St. Catherine of Siena, narrated by Tony Capobianco. This has been a Virgo Potens production.